Wow. Gods of Want is a short story collection by Taiwanese-American author K-Ming Chang. A while ago, I read her debut novel, Bestiary, which was an incredible piece of poetic urban fantasy fiction. And Gods of Want is pretty much more of the same, but it is so much bigger in terms of its imagination. If you haven't read Bestiary, I wholly recommend it. It showcases the incredible level of imagination and the themes that she enjoys exploring. But if you're ever impressed by the imagination of one person, read a short story collection by them. Because the boundless imagination that they have is just extrapolated and explored through so many different avenues. There is so much going on here in terms of imagination, poeticism, imagery. It's beautiful, it's exhausting almost. Gods of Want is a collection of surreal, fantastical, folktale-inspired short stories. And it is astounding. I don't know how to talk about this. Let's start off with the themes. Okay, in Bestiary and in Gods of Want, K-Ming Chang is often exploring three things. One is migration. She is a Taiwanese-American writer, and she is exploring the relationship between a person and migration itself, as well as the relationship between two different cultures and how those cultures cross over within a life, within a family. And speaking of family, the other thing she's exploring is family itself, family dynamics, especially within the women of a family, a mother and daughter, a grandmother and granddaughter, a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. And then the third thing that she's exploring is queerness. She's exploring how queerness is expressed and felt and diluted and filtered out into the air by our internal monologues, by our minds in relation to the world around us, the people around us, the things we experience. Migration, family, maternity, queerness, all of these things wrap up together in surreal and dark and strange, monstrous, twisted, gorgeous, beautiful ways. The stories in here might explore one of those themes, or all of them, or two of them, molded together in a Frankenstein's monster of themes and concepts and images, and I am so astonished by this collection. It is divided into three. There are three subsections of story here. The first section is called Mothers, and it explores family. There are 6 stories in the Mothers section, and they're all about maternal relationships in some way. The first story, for example, is called Aunt Land, and it's about a family of aunts, all the different women in a family, and how they relate to one another and their own personal experiences, and their relationship to migration, to their culture, to the new culture that they live in now. Again, the relationship between Taiwan and the US. The second section is called Myths, and it clearly takes a lot of inspiration from the Taiwanese folk culture that K-Ming Chang grew up in. That is a recurring motif and series of images and ideas that she leans on and relies on again and again and again. For example, there's a story in that section called Nine-Headed Birds. At the beginning of the story, it talks about how there is a bird in mythology with 9 heads, but it is born with 10 heads, and the 10th head is severed, and all rust in the world is actually blood from this 10th severed head. And then finally, the third and shortest section is 4 stories under an umbrella term called Moths. Mothers, Myths, Moths. Moths is kind of hard to pin down in terms of what it's thematically about, but it does contain my favourite story in this whole collection. And that story is called Resident Aliens. And it tells the story of a family that live in a converted slaughterhouse, and when they need extra money, they rent out the basement space to widows. And the whole story is just a series of short descriptions of all the different widows that have passed through. 26 different widows that have stayed in this basement, and it just describes each of their personalities and habits. And it is incredibly, wonderfully, beautifully surreal. It is my favourite story in this collection, just because it's so expressive of the author's attitudes, imagination, mental images, and also relationship to humanity, the way that she sees people and clearly takes people as an opportunity to learn. She seems to have an obsession with examining people and their habits and their ways of living and interacting with one another. There is so much to dig into thematically. Every story is a strange piece of surrealism with very clear motifs and themes that get repeated again and again and again. There's a lot of body horror, a lot of strange mythology that inspires the events of each tale. There's a lot of weird fairy tale logic that goes on, and all of it is exploring, as I said, these themes of motherhood, migration, the relationship between cultures, the relationship between a queer person and their family, their friends, their culture, the world around them. And they're all very feminist tales because they are about a woman's role within her family, women's relationships to one another, the complex, nasty, gross, soggy relationship between a mother and daughter. They are very surrealist feminist tales. But all of that aside, the most interesting and exciting thing about this is K-Ming Chang's incredible imagination. The way that she describes the characters and events here. For example, I think I need to just read out a few things so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about when it comes to the surrealism and the strange imagery here. Listen to this. My cousin was followed by a fish-shaped cloud that for years rained only on him, and we found out it was because in a past life he had been a country that caused a drought in another country, and this was the only way to atone for it, by being perpetually soggy. Years ago, a crow followed my cousin with a wedding ring in its beak, and we figured either the crow wanted to marry her, or this was some punishment for having stolen dead people's rings a country ago, and either way we probably deserved it. What a wonderful description. What a strange and wonderful passage. It's magical. The sheer imagery at play, the imagination. I just keep saying these words over and over again, imagery and imagination, but it's astonishing. As I said, my favourite story is called Resident Aliens, and in it there is a description of one of these strange widows. And I'm just going to read out the description of one of these widows, the 9th widow. Sometimes I pretend the widows are aliens from different planets, and they each adhere to their own gravity. And that is why the 9th widow floats instead of walks. And my mother loves her best because she doesn't get our carpet dirty. The floating widow has pigeons for feet, and she sits cross-legged in the basement and feeds them seeds, nuts, spools of thread, crickets, wads of manteau, hair, balls of newspaper that expand in their bellies and teach them the speech of politicians. The floating widow's pigeon feet are very politically active and shit only on gentrifiers in the neighbourhood, such as the man who goes jogging even when it rains. When he looks up, the floating widow is clouding overhead, her pigeon feet shitting into his mouth. I prefer living in basements because there are never any windows, the floating widow says. Because my bird feet will fly into windows and die, and then I'll have no way to leave or go anywhere. It's incredible! And this is constant. This level of strangeness, this Dali-inspired surrealism. So many of these stories just feel like a Dali painting turned into a narrative. But they're all inspired by folktales and fairy tales, and I just cannot express the level of excitement every time you start a new story in this collection. Every new tale in here is an opportunity to be shocked. It is a window into a strange new world of surrealism and quirky eeriness. But again, all of these stories have thematic depths to plunder if you choose to dig in, if you choose to explore. If you go into these stories with a flashlight switched on and you poke at the corners and you dig in and you see what's there, you can find so many thematic depths to explore. But you don't have to, I guess. You can just admire the imagination on display, the strange ways that she tells her stories. I want to read these stories again and again and again. I want to see what I can dig up, see what I can explore. What's also beautiful is the way that they're structured. The fact that every story in here kind of acts like a cone, where they begin with a seed, with a single statement, something very simple. And then by the end, they have expanded and extrapolated out in a three-dimensional way into big themes and ideas, into a moral of the story. But they'll begin with a single statement. A great example is the story... Can I even say this? Let's find out. A great example is the story Eating Pussy. which begins with the sentence, "Her name was Pussy, but the rumor was she didn't have one." That story is set in a high school environment where kids talk about each other and give each other nicknames or have strange names that their parents gave them because they were the children of immigrants, that kind of thing. And then by the end of this story, our protagonist has kind of fallen in love with this girl called Pussy. And our protagonist reveals that she can eat anything. She can literally put anything in her mouth, grind it down, and digest it. And Pussy says, "Eat me." And so she does. She opens up her jaw and she eats this entire girl named Pussy. It's about desire. It's about forbidden desire. It's about the strangeness of desire. It's about just how much our lust can take over our bodies and make us do impossible, strange things. And it's probably about so much more than that. It's very much up for interpretation in a lot of ways, just like poetry. This is poetry. And as you can tell from titles like Eating Pussy, it's also really funny. It's dark and strange and funny and satirical and off and angry at times. Especially some of the stories about mothers and daughters. The stories that are about family dynamics are sprinkled with frustration and agitation. There's one story in here about a woman whose mother-in-law basically keeps threatening to kill herself, and the protagonist insists that when her mother-in-law finally succeeds in dying, she won't miss her, she won't be sorry. I could go on and on. I could go on and on and on about Gods of Want and how entertaining and beautiful and strange and wonderful it is. I am astonished at the imagination here. Please, please read Gods of Want. Please read Bestiary. K-Ming Chang is one of a kind. Her imagination is boundless. She's so young, so talented. Oh my god. Huh. Subscribe for books.